Hi, my name is Bernhard Ruchti. I'm a pianist, organist and composer based in Switzerland, and this is my presentation of the third part of my big tempo project, which is all about historical tempo in the late 18th and in the 19th century. The first part is about Ludwig van Beethoven, the second part about Franz Liszt, and this third part now is all about the music of Robert Schumann, or more specifically about his Fantasy in C major, opus 17, which I have recorded at one of Europe's greatest concert halls, which is located in Lucerne, Switzerland. I'm here at the Just Music Studios in Munich, where all my recordings are produced, and I'm pleased to be able to deliver this introduction here. In the first segment, I'm going to talk about the fantasy itself, its history, some musical aspects, and then in a second and third segment, I'm going to talk about particular tempo questions with Schumann in general and about the fantasy specifically. Now, about the C major fantasy, this is without any doubt one of the most significant pieces of music written in the first half of the 19th century. And more than that, it's some sort of milestone even in the history of music. It is dedicated to Franz Liszt and was originally intended to help raising funds for a Beethoven monument in Bonn, Germany. Schumann composed the fantasy in 1835-36, and it was published a few years later in 1839. The link to Beethoven is in form of a quote toward the end of the first movement. There we find a reminiscence of Beethoven's lead to the distant beloved, opus 98, and it's that part toward the end where the singer says that he will send all the songs he has written to his beloved one. I will show you the original by Beethoven. Beethoven's version is in E flat major, and I'm going to transpose it to C major to have a better comparison. In Schumann's composition, this transforms into that. This quote, as I've mentioned, creates, of course, a link to Beethoven, but it is also closely linked to Schumann's own situation when he wrote the fantasy. It was that time when he had to fight for his bride-to-be, Clara Wieck. There were huge difficulties with her father, and the two lovers were unable to see each other for quite a long time. So the distant beloved in that context is clearly Clara. Later on, Schumann wrote to Clara about the composition of the fantasy. It's probably the most passionate piece I have ever written, a soul lamentation for you. Despite the link to Beethoven, the fantasy, and particularly the first movement, is entirely non-classical. Charles Rosen, the famous musicologist, calls it the monument that commemorates the death of the classical style. Why is that? First of all, the whole structure of the first movement is very unstable and vague. Throughout the approximately 19 minutes, the main key, C major, does not appear at all until the very end, specifically until that point when that Beethoven quote shows up. So the essence of the classical style, the establishment of the main key, is entirely missing, which makes this a real milestone indeed. In addition to that, Schumann uses some sort of constant dissolution of the music. Throughout the first movement, there are 38 ritardando indications, but only 6 are tempo indications. It's like the music slows down all the time and is constantly referring to something beyond the music. It is therefore a highly poetic work, which is typical for Schumann, and it comes as no surprise that we find poetic titles for each of the 3 movements in Schumann's autograph. It's Ruins for the first movement, Victory Arch for the second one, and Constellation for the third movement. And this is perhaps also one of the main challenges for the performer today, to catch that poetic level of the music. We also find a wonderful polyphony of sound, which is typical for Schumann, but needs a lot of skill to execute. I will give you an example for that. Starting at bar 69, we find 3 melodies and an accompaniment all together. First melody is this. Second one is this. And then a third one comes in. And this all is accompanied by this. And when it comes all together, it sounds like this. So this is what we can call a polyphony of sound. Franz Liszt, whom the fantasy is dedicated to, realized that special and intimate character of the piece. He wrote to Schumann on June 5th, 1839, "The fantasy, which is dedicated to me, is a work of highest standards." And later on, he says regarding a public performance, "Both the Chrysleriana and the fantasy are more challenging to be received by the public. I will spare them for later." So obviously he thought that the fantasy was too intimate to be performed in public. Clara Schumann started performing the fantasy in public in the 1860s, and after that the piece became more and more a part of the regular concert repertoire. As I've mentioned before, Schumann's Fantasy Opus 17 not only is one of the greatest compositions of the first half of the 19th century, but is also a very interesting work when it comes to historical tempo. What that means and how it affects our options for interpretation, this is what I'm going to talk about in the next segment. So please subscribe to my channel, don't forget to like and ring the bell to get notified.